Hi, thank you. Thanks, Andrew, for inviting me to present today. Um, so my name's Lynne. I'm one of the nurse practitioners from the immunisation service at the Royal Children's, and I'm going to present on a really practical approach to the migrant families and the partially vaccinated patient. So something that I do every day. We are getting a lot of inquiries, and we speak to a lot of GPs and practice nurses in the community to help because, and my next slide will say, I think when it goes over, oh, there you go. Look, catch-up vaccination is not easy, and I don't expect that anyone who is not a specialist in the area would find it easily. It's really confusing and complicated, so it's really okay to ask for help. There are many services around Australia who are specialists, and so it's okay to really take your time and try and break it down and approach it so that you come out with the right answers, because it can be very complicated. And what I'm going to show you next, oh God, I'm still having issues. Oh, there we go. So these are some of the things that people can be presented with. And I think anyone who's worked in general practice or immunisation services had one of these given to you, and your head just starts spinning and you're like, oh, that's really complicated. Most of the ones we see obviously are from Southeast Asia, India. Usually they will have some English on them so that you can decipher it. But in the bottom left corner, that is a Ukrainian one that got given to me. A nurse from Southwest Victoria sent that through, and it was right at the start of the Ukrainian invasion when we had a few families come to Australia through relatives. And it was very hard to get a Ukrainian interpreter. This nurse just got really stuck. She sent it through to us, and I tried to get a Ukrainian interpreter, and it was very difficult. And Google Translate really became my friend to help me try and break it down to try and work out what this child had, because it was actually a very complicated vaccination history. And then, you've got ones in the top right, that was a Thai one, I think. And then there's just others, and they can be really confusing. There's the middle one, there's stickers all over the page, there's dates written everywhere. It's just really about trying to take your time and work methodically through it so that you can really get the right answers. And sometimes it's not easy to do, even for me. And I think I did 3 yesterday from all different countries. So what's the best way to approach it? So it's really about being methodical, you know, really looking for the dates, looking for the diseases, and trying to work out what the timelines are. So I find the best way is to transcribe it onto a worksheet, and that's on my next slide. I'll show you the ones that I tend to use, and just keeping in mind your minimum intervals and your age limits for the Australian vaccination program. If you can, ask families to have it translated, but most of the ones we see do have lettering that you can break it down, like a DTP, Hep B, IPV. You can usually work it out quite easily, although, as I said, with that Ukrainian one, it was impossible. So there are government services available. They're not easily accessible, but they are there. And most countries do have a relatively similar schedule to Australia. They're just a little bit different in the timing, and some of them don't vaccinate against as many antigens as we do, in particular one's meningococcal. So these are the resources that are available. Now, my favourite one is actually the pink card, the immunisation plan for children. That one is not, I tried to find a PDF online and I couldn't. So that's actually a photo of me holding it. You can order that off and this is obviously a Victorian resource, but off the HealthVic website. It's really good because it breaks down the antigens. So you can actually circle what the child's had and cross out what they haven't at each time point. The immunisation handbook has the worksheet online, and there's also the one from Services Australia that we used to fill out and then send through to AIR to upload. That one has changed recently because they've now just sort of named the vaccines, which makes it a little bit harder because you can't actually break down the antigens and actually circle what they've had. So that's why I really like the pink card. But any of those resources are really quite helpful. And I think it's about writing it down separately to what the family's presented you with, because it really just puts it clear in your mind what they've had. Okay, so these are sort of the common themes that we see across the international histories. Every now and then you'll get a child that started vaccination at 4 weeks. Now that doesn't count. In Australia, it has to be begun anytime after 6 weeks. So doses that are given less than 6 months of age are not counted as valid. There's also the hepatitis B birth plus 2 schedule. That is actually acceptable, but the third dose must be over 24 weeks of age. So they've got to be over 6 months of age to be acceptable in the Australian schedule. Oral polio, and it was interesting because Deborah and I think Sarah before her talked a little bit about polio overseas. Some kids, particularly from India, have had so many doses of polio. It's just repeated time and time again. Sometimes they'll have an oral polio as well as an injected polio at the same time point, which can be very confusing, and AIR won't accept it. So I usually just put the one dose in. Oral polio is also given at birth in many, many countries. AIR won't accept it. So I usually just don't put it on and just start at the 6 or 2 month time point. Now, vaccination schedule that's a little bit more accelerated is also quite common. So 2, 3, 4 months, or 6 weeks, 10 weeks, 14 weeks is also quite common. And usually it's okay for your DTPs, your polios and hip. AIR doesn't like a hip that's been given less than 6 months of age, but it will be accepted. You just have to ring them, or it will be partially processed. And you can see on the picture, I think it's a little bit blurry, that partially processed, when it comes up, it's quite frustrating because then you have to ring AIR, stay on hold for 15 minutes until you get through to get them to accept it. The third dose of hepatitis B, again, just needs to be above that 24-week age. And we do see that sometimes it's given a lot earlier. So some of these kids may need a booster of hepatitis B. AIR will often not ask for it, but it's really important to check your time points to make sure that it is after that sort of 24-week age, just to ensure that long-going protection. So just continue on the common themes. And again, Deborah touched on it. Many countries give measles first dose at 9 months. Many, many countries, particularly India, many South American countries. And that's just because the immunity from the mother starts waning at 6 months of age. By 9 months, it's completely gone. So countries with high prevalence of measles give their first dose at 9 months of age. As Deborah said, in Australia, we don't need to do that. We're a very protected society, thankfully, with our high vaccination rate. But doses given overseas at 9 months, they're not a valid dose in Australia. Our 2 doses have to be given over 12 months of age, or from 11 months it will count, but from 12 months of age is the standard scheduled dose. So a lot of these children have had an MMR at 9 months and may have had another one around 15 months, or sometimes it's 4 years. So a lot of them do need catch up with an MMR. China will often give an meningococcal A or C. Now, more commonly, the younger kids are getting an ACWY, but we do want to see them having a meningococcal ACWY, particularly if they're born after July 2018, which is when it was added to the Australian schedule. Really, all children arriving should be offered a meningococcal ACWY because there are strains that we do see in Australia. And obviously, we'd love them to have meningococcal B, but Victoria, they just won't add it to our schedule yet. Hopefully, that's going to come soon. And meningococcal is definitely not on a lot of Southeast Asian schedules, particularly India. It's not on there at all. So the majority of those kids are going to need a pneumonitis vaccine. Now, pneumococcal. So you really want to ensure a child's had a dose over 12 months of age, and that's really for the ongoing protection up until the age of 5 years, where they're at highest risk of severe disease. So you want to make sure that they've had that one dose. Now, most countries will have pneumococcal on their schedule. It does come off AIR, so AIR's not going to ask for it after the age of 2. So if they're a new migrant and you've put all their vaccines in, you might find that AIR's not asking for it. But it's really important to give them a dose. We do still see rates of pneumococcal in children less than 5 years. So there's one to remember because AIR's not going to ask for it. Now, refugees. So, look, majority of refugees that come into Australia come through the right channels. Okay, they've come through the international gateway where they've had all their catch-up vaccines. But with the Afghanis, and that's the top picture, that we all saw those horrific images on the media of people crammed on planes. A lot of them didn't get proper processing when they entered. And our service in particular, they were put into a hotel in Carlton, and we just had families showing up on our doorstep to emerge. They present to emerge because they had got the letter from Centrelink. They'd done all the Medicare processing, but they hadn't actually had the vaccines. And to get their payments, the kids had to be vaccinated. So we had these families rolling up with 7 children who'd all had some form of vaccination overseas, but there was no record at all. So for starters, we tried to refer them on to our refugee health service, but we needed to get them up to date because these families need the payments, and that's the law. Like, they're bound by the law. They had to be vaccinated. So if there's no history, absolutely, if you've got time, go ahead, do your serology, measles, mumps, rubella, varicella, hepatitis B. But if there's no history, and with these kids, we just started over. We just went back to the start and did them all again. Everyone, we know that the repeated doses are not going to cause harm. If they've had a DTP recently, yep, there might be some inflammation. It might be a red hot arm. But in these kids, it was probably going to be fairly unlikely. So there are, and I wouldn't be surprised if some of these families presented in the community as well. They were desperate. They had nothing. It was quite a horrific process. But I think they're all well settled now. And that was a similar story with the Ukrainians, but some of them did actually come with histories, which was amazing. So that's just something to keep in mind. It is okay just to start over, but serology will often, a lot of them will have had a measles vaccine, so you can do the serology. Okay, so just moving on to the partially vaccinated child and vaccine hesitancy. I think since COVID, this is something we're seeing a lot more of, because there was just there's all the questions around the COVID vaccines, and it's really made people go and look into the schedule as well. So I see a lot of these families. We speak to a lot of them over the phone. I also see a lot of them in our clinic alongside our paediatricians. And I think there's the right approach and then there's the wrong approach. A lot of these families, they feel bad for questioning vaccination as it is because most people will just do it. So it's really important not to judge them. If I sit in clinic and say to the family, you just have to do the schedule, that's just the way it is. They're not going to do it. They'll get up and they'll walk out. So you've just got to really not judge them, accept that it's okay to question vaccination. Don't tell them that it's an NIP or nothing. And doing an alternative schedule is quite complicated, but sometimes it's just anything to get them across the line, okay? And don't try and force vaccination on them. It is okay. It's their child. It's okay to question it. It's okay to want to protect your child, but do it the right way. Obviously, the most families I see are hesitant. The anti-vax do not come and see me. They're not interested. They're not having it. They're hesitant. They just want to know it's okay. They want to know it's not going to hurt their child. So it's okay for them to ask some questions. And definitely don't send them away with no information. These families that are hesitant, most of them want to do it. They just maybe want to do it a little bit different, do a little bit slower, and that's okay. So it's about just being able to provide them with the right resources so that they have something to read whilst they're at home. And just be open to having conversation with them. So it is okay not to be an expert. I've had some really curly questions thrown at me and I'll just sit there and go, whoa, I actually don't know. I don't know the answer to that because I need to go and read this very strange website that you've read. So I will often say to them, look, I can't answer that question. I'm sorry. But I know that what you're saying is probably not true. And here's some more recommended websites to have a look at. So I've opened up resources in front of the families many times just to try and find out what they've read so that I can give them the correct answer. And if they've got lots of questions or if they're wanting to do it a different way, it's okay to refer them on. In Melbourne, we have RCH and we've got Monash. We've got paediatricians, nurse practitioners who are more than happy to sit down with these families for sometimes an hour at a time to answer their questions, to go through the resources and to come up with a different plan. So you can refer them on and that's 100% okay because these families are not easy. Some of them are very, very challenging. So these are some of the resources that I really like. Now on the right, I've got a picture of a continuum of vaccine acceptance. This come from John Hopkins in America. So the families that we tend to see are the hesitant. So they're the ones in the middle. Okay. The acceptors, like me, when I had my children, I didn't work in immunisation then, but the nurse told me I had to go get them, so off I went. Yeah, good. I'm just going to go and have them. And that's most people. Some will be a little bit unsure, but will still go and do it. And others are just quite hesitant. They've got lots of questions. They want to do it. They understand why the child has to have it, but they just want to make sure that it's safe for their child. And then you've got the other end who refuse it. And we don't really see them because they're not going to have it. And that's, that's their choice. It's their child. I can't force them to do it. So yeah, the resources. So Melbourne Vaccine Education Centre, that's run by the MCRI. A lot of my colleagues, Dr. Nigel Crawford oversees that. He's obviously the head of ATAGI. It's building up the resources. We've got some really great information pages on there. NCIS is another one. Sky, so sharing knowledge about immunisation, really breaks it down and puts it into plain and simple language for the families. CHOP, so Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, that's a great website, and I refer a lot of families to that. It breaks down all the ingredients and really looks at aluminium, because that's a really common question we get, and really just really plain and simple language. MVEX sort of modelled a little bit off that. And then I actually really like the question about vaccination booklet. So you can order that off the Australian government website. It's got the most common questions that we get. It's got aluminium, it's got autism, it's got all those. It's a really good resource to give to the family. So I always have some on hand, and it's actually very popular. The families really like reading through it. Okay, so just looking at some common themes. And that picture there, that's the black hole, the Google black hole. And some of my families will come in and they say, look, I think we've gone down the black hole, and they want to get back out of it. And that's why they come and see me. So during COVID, during the lockdowns, lots of people went down that hole. Okay, they just too much time on their hands. The COVID vaccine was being talked about a lot. People were unsure. And so they started Googling, and then they got really, really worried. Okay, because we all know that the internet's a minefield of information out there, particularly around immunisation. So that, yeah, I just thought that was a good picture. So look, a lot of the families, it's multi-generational. Mum and dad are maybe anti-vax, but now the child's a bit more educated, or they've married a pro-vaccination partner and they want to vaccinate their child, or sometimes they don't, and there's conflict. We often see that goes through the courts, unfortunately, with one partner trying to force the other one to vaccinate. They've obviously divorced. And then they've got a common theme is the older children who are fully vaccinated, and then one's been diagnosed with autism. And straight away the parents like, the vaccines have done it. So they've just stopped vaccinating the other children, or not vaccinated them at all. And then they'll come down because they've been, child needs to go to childcare. They need to be vaccinated, but they're scared. They don't want another child with autism. That's okay. So we try and educate them, make them feel a bit more safe about it. We might do that. A lot of those families will do an alternative plan, a slower plan. And then adverse event. It's really important to report adverse events if they're coming in, a febrile convulsion or a HHE, like a faint, anything which has really scared the parent after vaccination, just report it to Safe Vet, because some of these parents just stop vaccinating. They're petrified. And if they're not followed up properly, then they won't do it again. And we actually had two, which was quite random, actually drop in last week, just out of the blue, had a HHE at 6 weeks or 4 months, and stopped vaccinating. The child was now nearly kinder age, and they needed to start again. Parental anxiety, it's another one. The parents they've got a history of anxiety, and now they've had a child and they're just anxious about what might happen to their child. And then there's the ones that have just gone down the black hole. They've done too much research and they're petrified. So it's about trying to revert that and give them right websites to look at, so that they can re-educate themselves so they feel safe. So catching up with my thing crosses over the writing, so sorry. But catch up with a partially vaccinated child. So usually, if they're partially vaccinated, they're going to have had some vaccines, okay? So use AIR as a guide. Most of these kids might have had a scheduled spot, so the 2-monthers or, 2 or 4-monthers and then stop. So AIR is going to tell you what they need. So if you look at that picture, you can clearly see, and this child is just overdue, they're 18-monthers. You can see the need DTP, MMR, varicella. So it's going to tell you, and it's just sort of about looking at them and seeing how you can group those vaccines together. Obviously, they've never had an MMR before and they're less than the age of 4. They're going to need and a varicella, sorry. They're going to need MMR and a varicella separate. You can use a catch-up calculator. I'm not the biggest fan of it. I find it quite confusing. A practice nurse sent through a catch-up calculator printout to me only a few months ago, and I went, oh, wow, that's really, I've never used it, and I found it so confusing the way it was right, but the way it had split out the vaccines and given you do it Infamrix, or you could do an Infamrix Hexa, or you could do an Inadrix being an Infrix and an active. So sort of separated them all out, and I found that really confusing, especially to someone who's not a specialist in immunisation, like, you know, practice nurses who it's not their everyday job, and it was really confusing. But it does tell you what vaccines they need. So it's just sort of about, you always want to give them grouped together. Maybe you can give an Infamrix Hexa over an Infamrix and an Inadrix. If they need multiple doses, that's fine. Some kids would catch up. We will give an Infamrix Hexa when they don't need a Hib or they don't need a polio. You're going to give one vaccine instead of giving 2 or 3. So a bonus dose, I'll always just explain it to the family and say, look, they're going to get a bonus Hib. It's not going to cause any harm. Are you okay with that? And the families are fine, because it means the child's not going to have 3 injections. Now, it's really important to remember your required spacings, and this is particularly relevant with the 6 months between the dose 3 and 4 of the DTP. Some families have forgotten, and it's actually quite common to forget the 6-month scheduling point for Hexa at 6 months, because there's no maternal child health visit at 6 months. There's one at 8 months. So the family hasn't been told, now you need to go and get your 6-month vaccine, so they forget. So they might come in late, and they might get it sometimes with the 12-month vaccines. And then you've really got to remember that, so ensure there's 6 months between the 6-month vaccine and the 18-month vaccine. So it's just really important to monitor your dates. On air will always tell you the dates are going to be there when it's next due. So just be very careful, because it's something that has tripped me up in the past, because I haven't looked at it properly and I've just gone and given it and then realised, oh, they only had one 4 months ago. Okay, so it happens to everyone. Okay, so it's really particular look at your dates. Okay, Infamrix Hexa or now Vaxalis, to split it or not, very common question. A lot of families, it's probably the first question families ask me when I see them in clinic. I'm really worried about overloading the immune system. I don't want to give all those injections at once. It's going to make my child sick. So why? And I always say to them, yep, there are a lot of injections in there. They're in there so the child doesn't have to have 6 injections. Okay, we put them together to minimize the trauma to the child. And when you really break it down, you go from 1 vaccine 3 times at 2, 4, and 6 months. And if you split it out, you'll go from 4 vaccines 3 times. So that's 12 vaccines. Most families will see why it's 1 injection. You know, each additional vaccine carries with it pain, trauma. And if you get a 3-year-old coming in to start vaccination and the family want to split the Hexa, by the time they've had a couple of visits, they're screaming as soon as they pull into the car park. Okay, they know what they're coming for. Each vaccine's got additional additives and preservatives, and there's a risk of side effects with each different needle. Okay, so most times when I really break it down and say that to the families, they're like, okay, yeah, I can see why, and they'll do a Hexa. Most of them. But I'll always, you know, when I'm saying this to them, I say to them, it is okay if you want to split it. I don't recommend it. This is why. But if you want to do it, that's fine. And some families will split it the first time and then see sense and said next visit they'll have a Hexa. It is one of the most common questions. So here's some tips for gaining parental confidence. And this is confidence. This is not going to be relevant to all kids. Okay. The families that need childcare or kinder, okay, they can't do a slower schedule. If they need, and some families will come and see me and their child's starting kinder in 2 months. I'm like, well, you're going to have to really get them up to date, because doing a slower schedule or doing it a bit different is not going to be accepted. So it's definitely not an option for all children, and it's quite age dependent. A lot of families I see, the child's already sort of 2 or 3, so we can do we can sort of break it out a bit. So, and the families really love it when you actually give them options. Some of it's a real control thing. They want to be in control of what their child has. They don't want the government telling them, this is the schedule, you are doing it this way. So when you sort of really say, okay, look, we can do it a little bit different. It's not what I recommend, and that's what I always say to them. At the end of the day, I want them to have the national schedule. The schedule is what it is for a reason. It's to protect your child. But if you want to do it different, that's okay. The risk is to your child. So 1 dose of Prevnar is all they need after 12 months. And I will always strongly recommend it. If I see a 3-year-old or a 2-year-old is not asking for a Prevnar, but I'll always say to them, we still see it and it's nasty. you really should consider having a Prevnar 13 for your child. Some families will have it. Some are like, no, I don't need it. I don't want it. And that's also, I haven't put that up there, but Rotarix. As soon as you tell them the child that Rotarix is not compulsory, they love it. I want your child to have it because I want them to be protected. I used to work in ED 15 years ago. Every second child had Rota and they were so sick. I just dehydrated. We don't really see it anymore because the vaccine's been so successful. But if you tell them, look, it's not compulsory. If you don't want them to have it, then that is one that they can miss. 2 doses of HIP. So obviously there's 4 doses on the schedule, but after the age of 1, they just need 2, or after the age of 18 months, it's just 1. The blood test after the MMR. So you can have 2 injections or you can submit your child to a blood test. Some families will do the blood test because they don't want that second MMR because they are so worried about autism, and you can talk to them to blue in the face about how the MMR does not cause autism, but families are worried about it. So you can offer them that blood test, and some of them will do it. And if they're immune to all 3, fine, exemption to air, they're immune. I have had some that are not immune to one of the components, and it's a very hard discussion, but then they have to go back and have the second one. Now, the removal of the 18-month dose of DTP. So that's, if you see an older child, it's easy to take off because there's that 6-month gap between the 3rd and 4th dose of a DTP. So if you're doing a catch-up schedule and they're already going to be 3.5, you just go straight to that 4-year-old DTP IPV, and that'll take a dose off. And that's another one that the families really like. But this is, again, I just really want to say it's not able to be done with all children. Okay, it's really age specific, and these get quite complicated. This is probably, obviously I do this a lot, so I'm quite, it's my specialty, but it can get very complicated. So these families may need a referral to a specialist service. And this is just an example of an alternative schedule. And again, they can get very complicated because you need to ensure your spacing's correct, and you really want to ensure at each visit that your timing's right, that your spacing's right, because the parents get confused. They might come back 3 or 4 weeks later and it's too soon. And that can lead to errors. And these are the families where errors happen, the ones that are hesitant, that are already worried. They're the ones where it's going to go wrong. So you just got to be really careful. And if you're doing a slow schedule where the child's coming every couple of weeks for a needle, they're not going to love it if they're older. So good distractive play and trying to make the first visit a good one, just to really stop that trauma, because I've had kids that as soon as they pull into the car park, they're screaming. The parents bring them up under their arm and you're like, this is what I told you would happen if you do this as a 3-year-old. They know what it is. And it's really important to try and make it a good experience the first time. Yeah, so you can sort of see how I've spaced that out every 2 weeks. This schedule is not ideal, and I don't like when I do this for families. It's definitely not my preference, but if it's going to get them across the line, I'll do it. So just things to consider. An alternative schedule is okay. If they want to do it that way, that's fine. You've got to take, and when I first started immunisation, my colleague said to me, you've got to take each vaccine as a win. Every time they have one, it's good because you're protecting them against another disease. So take it as a win. It is okay to complete 1 vaccine at a time. It's not the way I would do it. It's not the way I recommend it. But if that's what they want to do, that's okay. And their confidence does grow. I've definitely had families that will do 1 vaccine the first couple of times, and the 3rd visit, like, oh, let's just get it done. So then we'll just give the rest. So it does get easier if they go through it. Yes, they go through it. That's it. Thanks for listening. I'm more than happy to be contacted if anyone's got questions.